Let's start.
Hey guys, super happy to be here once again. And today I'm very, very excited because Owen Tapiero is here. And I think that those type of conversations are actually more than inspiration, are actually educational in terms of wisdom and in terms of actual considerations and conclusions about the quantitative world and quantitative finance and quantitative trading out of the mouth of someone who does it for 25 years, if I'm not wrong. I'm not wrong, right? Right or wrong? I'm not wrong.
No, you're not wrong.
25 years. So this is a plenty of experience, and I'm super happy and I'm super glad to have you here. That's an absolute pleasure. And yeah, I'll let you to present yourself.
So, first of all, thank you for having me today. I'm going
It's
to
our pleasure.
be I'm going to be really quick with the formalities. I'm a quantitative researcher currently at Tidal, which is a digital asset systematic trading technology company, which developed fully automated momentum strategy. Those strategies have been live since mid 2021, and I'm happy to inform that it has outperformed the market. Um,
Congratulations.
and it, and of course that it's been managing millions of dollars currently, and we hope for more, of course, uh, for a worldwide institution, but also high net worth individual clients. So that's what I'm currently doing. Um, now the thing if now I'm going to give them a little bit more spicy version of myself. I think and I see myself as a very unusual, in many ways, an unusual quantitative researcher. I haven't gone through the normal kind of path that most quantitative researcher go through. Uh, that means that, and I'll start from the fact that I have a bachelor's and a master's degree in economics, which is kind of rare to start with a bachelor in economics or master's in economics and end up as a
It's
quantitative researcher.
rare, but it's still a little bit forgotten.
So, can
It's
you
a pretty
repeat
much
that?
forgotten phenomenon. I think that economics masters in economics really likes the researching about quantitative methodologies to deploy in the market. That's a phenomenon that we see today very widely. But yes, it's very rare. Just to be frank, and those who are actually excelling in the field, not necessarily has any relation to their economic background.
Well,
Just as by the way.
I'm gonna say it from my experience, and it's been a while, right, since I was a student, a university student, a graduate, and an undergraduate student. Um, the thing is that, well, my luck, all right, is that I got to learn a very at the time, it was very econometric centric kind of degree. So I got the chance to work with a lot of quantitative models. That being said, the problem with the problem for a student studying economics, I think, is that one needs very heavy understanding and knowledge of the mathematical language. All right, not necessarily the mathematical modeling, but the mathematical language, and it is a bit of a barrier for most students who start their BA and then continue to a graduate level, which is even more mathematically intensive degree. So that's why I don't think you get in economics the necessary, in economic degree, you get the necessary quantitative formation to become a quant researcher. So that's
Mhm.
the reality of it. All right. This is in my view. We learn about a little bit. We learn econometrics, which is really fine and it's very important. And we learned even the fundamental of those econometric models about stationarity. And we are familiar, we're not scared of it, but it's to go the step ahead from economics, from someone who does an economic major and become a quant, there is need to be a little bit more steps than the usual. And it requires a certain curiosity, which I was lucky to have, not because I'm a curious person, but because my path kind of led me into this world, especially when I decided to do a PhD. And a PhD in Israel is pretty much a freestyle PhD. In the US, you get a very good formation and you have a certain path. In Israel, you kind of design your own path. And that's how slowly I found myself dealing with financial economics issue of asset pricing and factor pricing and so on. And slowly, I found myself
I,
in the.
I would have to stop and to answer your question about the freestyle PhD methodology that it's actually implemented here in Israel. For you, as of your perspective nowadays, what do you think about like a PhD candidate who actually tends to start, I don't know, a research lab or committing to a paper? What do you think about like that freestyle without the formation that is well established in the US? How it's actually impacted the differentiation about like the research grade and the quality of the research, how the professor who leads the PhD candidate actually knows how to direct the PhD candidate, although it's very freestyle and not very formative like in the US.
Well, it's a heavy question because I mean it's if if we take the average PhD Israeli candidate, right, who is doing his PhD in Israel is on average a very different person than the PhD candidate in the US. Just very simple details is that most Israeli, at least that PhD candidate that I came across with, most of them already had a job, had their career. So it's basically made on the side of their career or their respective careers. So, and as a consequence, the average age is quite high. I mean, when I did my PhD, I was 30, right? I was 30 and I already worked at the Israeli Central Bank. And I worked for a mutual fund managing company, for a small mutual fund company. So I came with that kind of background. And my peers who were next to me were either a bit my age or even some of them older, even significantly older. I mean, one PhD candidate who was with me was a student of my father. So, and he was a student of my father when I was 6, 7 years old. This is this is one thing you have to take into account. So, as a consequence, most of the PhD candidates coming in Israel, they come already either ready with a ready scope, ready problem to tackle that comes from their work experience, right? So that's to start. And therefore they come with a certain, most of them that I met already know what they want to research. So that's one. And two, um, the formation, there is not really a lot of formation during that time. I mean, we do have to go to certain lecture that we choose, but there is not a formal, strict formation. Um, and then there is the issue of your supervisor. And the supervisor, that's a different story. So if you have some supervisor, are more, let's say, do more of the micromanagement, tend to micromanage things, and some less. For example, in my case, My supervisor, who was an expert in insurance, and that's her was her topic. Her name is Professor Yafa Maknes. Gave me pretty much a free hand and kind of directed me in a very vague, kind of way, and pushed me
Really?
to discover other different topics that comes from her world. For example, when I worked on fat tail distribution and the probability of probability assignments and the uncertainty that comes around of measuring probabilities, I was basically moving forward the idea of Knightian uncertainty, and she's like, okay, and how that works and how that fails in the expected utility theory. At the time, I was really fascinated by by the intertwined, kind of, now I'm losing a bit my words, but the fact that how asset pricing and expected utility theory kind of go hand in hand. And then she elevated me and she says, look, there's also the anticipated utility theory, the prospect theory of Kahneman and Tversky. See how that works, how that really tackles the problems that you're trying to research. So that is this is kind of a guidance, but that's a style of supervision that I have. I mean, you can have a different style of supervision where, it's very constructive. So it depends what you want. I think really in terms of what I had is not so good for having an academic career, and I don't have an academic career. Um, if one wants to do an academic career, that's a different story, and then the formation is really more important here, and the supervision is really important. That's why if a person comes to me and asks for my advice on going on and doing his PhD, I would recommend do it in the US for that reason. Um, so
That's understandable. That's understandable. Look, Oren, let me ask you a question. Out of your point of view, fast forward nowadays, understanding how like or figuring out how to properly do quant research and how to properly tackle quantitative challenges and how to resolve or thinking about the resolution of quantitative boundaries and quantitative obstacles. What do you think is the rightest or not rightest? Like from your perspective, from Tidal, like what do you think would be the rightest approach to tackle a PhD research nowadays? And I would love if you can explain me how do you envision, like if you're going to be giving guidelines to the candidate itself, what do you think would be the most appropriate manner to do the research over? For example, I'm asking for something that will have congruency to nowadays industry, and in some aspect would have complete alignment to the formation prerequisites of formal university.
uh, all right. I'm trying. It's a big question, right? So let's construct it. Let's try. I'll try
Well,
to
let's construct it
deconstruct.
a little bit more.
Um,
Let's think about it. Let's have an open conversation about it.
well, all right. I'm going to start. The advantage of doing PhD is that one really learns how to perform research. Okay, so and understand the process of running research. Now, there are several ways of running research. There are some of them more rigorous, some of them less rigorous. Uh, the real question is the most important part is what is the question, right? Um, so let me try to think
Like
really
in terms of what, like
the what,
what kind of
what
question?
we're researching. So I'm gonna say,
Okay.
all right. So and everything basically, and it's very funny because it's really. It's something I've learned working with in machine learning models is that the question is the most important. The target is always more important, even sometimes even more than the feature itself, right? Because you're
Oh,
asking a question. When you're asking a question, and when you ask the question that you're trying to research, you frame the problem. What do I mean by that? I mean the fact that, you need to ask a question that is, and it's true even when for everything, I think, that you can find an answer to, okay? That has a solution and has the most, and that you can find the most complete solution to. All right.
mhm.
I'm gonna say it now very simple. Let's take it to a different situation. You're asking yourself, I want to build a machine learning model that does XYZ. All right.
Okay.
So you're asked the question is your target, right? Given certain a feature X, I get an answer for Y, right? So now the question is, what is the Y? So there is one thing. So I'll give you an example. There is a difference, all right, between asking, okay, I want to predict the future price in X time ahead, days, for example,
Okay.
and I want that's one. And another question is, I want to predict the future trend in the coming X days ahead. Okay?
Makes sense. Okay.
Now, they sound similar, right? They sound similar, but they're not.
Mhm.
Okay, so and why is that they're not? Is because trend is not the same as price increase. Trend is a trend, right? And sometimes what you mean is that what do I mean is that it is really that when you think of price, let's say I'm predicting that the price will go up in 7 days. You're what the problem is that as we all know, the price fluctuates around the trend, right? The price fluctuates around the
Correct.
trend, right?
Correct.
So it's much difficult. It's a way difficult target, okay, to predict than the trend. Trend is much more constant, right? If I take a very simple example, let's take the price change in 5 days ahead, for example, and let's take the slope of a trend regression and try to predict either of them. We'll see that the slope is easier to predict because it's more stable. It's more stable. It's less noisy, and so on. So, in a machine learning context, right? The question of what you are predicting is really important, and that goes the same for research. If you're asking the right.
It's exactly, you would have to articulate it even though. You have to know exactly, like articulate, even though the machine learning model is already training and you would like to make it more interpretable, you would like to know what actually happens in the machine learning model so you would be able to articulate it. That's heavily related to the why, to the context itself of building or initiating the model like in the beginning.
Well, maybe I haven't understood you properly, uh, but in many ways, in quantitative finance, and this is very important, the question is always more important. I gave you the
Mhm.
example of machine learning to give it a real physical, actual, as actual how it does, an actual situation, right? Uh,
Correct.
right? So this is in a low level kind of, okay, the target, you need to decide the appropriate target. You cannot chase, you cannot, there is a difference between predicting a trend, for example, and predicting a price movement. These are not the same things. A trend is a
Mhm.
trend, and a price movement can be part of a trend or it can be part of a noise. We don't know. This is a very complicated situation, and Professor, very the celebrated Professor Lopez de Prado from ADIA, constantly talks about that topic, about that issue. Um, but if we go a bit higher level, before the machine learning implementation, it's the same story. You have to ask the appropriate question. If you cannot ask the appropriate, if you don't ask the appropriate question, you're basically entering into a path that you cannot
Mhm.
solve, and you will never come to resolve. Um, so this is very important, and that's true also, and that's something you learn in PhD, right? Uh,
Correct.
I remember the first advice I got when I did my PhD, or the first question I got is uh, was not even what was the question. The first question I've got is, do you have the data? Right?
Mhm. Okay.
So because if you don't have data, you cannot answer the question, right? Empirically, you can write theories, but
Obviously,
it doesn't
it
answer.
doesn't relate. Correct.
Right. So you can find many identities, and you can't. And another thing, which is also very, very important, is that when you ask the question, is how you frame it. Um, and this is the most important thing. This is the really most important part of it. So,
Mhm.
for example, I'll give you an example. One thing I was trying to answer in my PhD thesis is how do we price uncertainty? And
Okay.
what is uncertainty? It's in the Knight. Knight is a famous author who wrote a very important thesis in 1921, um, a thesis that has been more quoted than read, I have to say. But he makes a very important distinction between risk and uncertainty. All right.
Okay.
Risk is when you know the probabilities in advance, and uncertainty is when you don't know the probabilities, which is this is the reality we live in. We live in a reality we don't know what are the true probabilities. We only have to estimate the probabilities. So this is a very meta kind of a problem. Now, the question I frame is how do we not how so there were two questions I was trying to answer. One, I think I kind of answered, and the second, it had no solution. So the first one is how do we account for it, which is which is problematic. How can I count something that I don't know? Right? It's about I have information. How do I count it? Is something as I don't know, and how do I price it, which is a different kind of question. How do I price something given what I don't know? These are two things.
Yeah.
And and since
Correct.
because this duality between pricing do depend on probabilities, the fat tails are the way for me to price what I don't know.
Hmm. Let me ask you this, Dylan. After speaking about like your perspective about about PhDs and about research and about if doing that in a rigorous manner or a less rigorous manner, I would definitely like to hear more about your perspective about machine learning. You have mentioned Monaco Lopez Prado, and its book, which is spectacular book and an entry point for the quantitative world that everyone has to read. Um, and I would like to ask you a few questions about if if like hypothetically pretending now that you're going to be aiming to train a machine learning model, how would you craft how would you craft a question? How would you find a need for a machine learning model? How do you know how to build a machine learning properly, like in terms of data, in terms of feature engineering, in terms of how do you structure, or like even though model selection is a heavy question. So I would like to think or with you, or I would like to hear your thoughts about what are your main criteria when you're actually aiming to build one, and what do you look for as an output? Like, what do you see? How do you make it more interpretable? How do you generalize the results? I think I think that like learning out of your experience might resonate better with the perspective that we're aiming to provide to the listeners.
Um, well, you're asking some very tough questions to which I don't have any definite answers, because I ask myself this every time at
Yeah,
every
obviously,
iteration.
this is our routine.
Of course, and it's of course, and it's part of the routine. I'll start by saying, to try something. I'll start maybe by digressing a little bit. First of all, it's important to frame machine learning or AI, to frame it in the proper context. Uh,
What do you mean?
what do I
What type
mean
of
is
context?
it's very important, and a lot of people tend that I speak to, especially beginners, they think they can find alpha from using a machine learning algorithm. Okay? And a lot of people think that way.
If it would be that easy, believe me, me and you,
Right. I mean,
we would enjoy life.
right, it's kind of the dream. Let's create this AI that does all the work for us, and let's go to and we'll go and play golf. Well, we don't play golf where I am, but
Let's
we do
play
some.
basketball. I think
My
it's
knees are
fun.
already cannot take basketball, so my knees are already. I used to play actually. I used to play.
Seriously.
Yes, yes. During my PhD years, I used to play. It was great until I sprained my ankle.
Right.
Um, but that's a different story. Uh, so no, of course, it's not for alpha, and I'm gonna say it's a lot of, and this is I came across with the people I worked in, the situation I work in, even myself have fell into this trap. Even myself have fell to this trap. So I'm not better than anyone else in that sense, but the understanding that it's a mean and not an end. And too many times, the machine learning, the AI, the reinforcement learning, all that is an end and not the mean. And this is a problem. Okay, it
Okay.
has to be really, really one frame. And when you come with that idea, when you understand that it's the mean and not an end, all right, that's when you get it right. So this is step number
Oh,
one, right?
so it has like a certain consequences as you present it, like in terms of when you like it's not the idea, it's like how do you do that? Like let me just clarify what you have just said because I think it's a really strong point.
Um, Meaning that, what it is, it's supposed to help us. It's supposed to help us to make better decision. It's supposed to help us to quantify things that we cannot quantify. It's supposed to help us to find, whatever kind of relationships. But it's not gonna help us make money. I'm now being a little bit vulgar, but it's not what we need. It's not what we need to work for. It needs to work for us. And I'll give you a very simple example. All right, very simple example. Of an exercise I got, I was submitting my resume all over the place. Okay. And for what I mean, and I was getting, those sometimes they send you a homework to do, right? And the homework I
Correct.
got was to implement Jagadish and Tietman momentum strategy, which is a very basic strategy where you kind of evaluate, you take the whole list of stocks. Let's take all the stocks of the S&P 500, right? You rank them by their momentum, their yearly return or something like that, or monthly return, doesn't matter. And basically you long the 10% and you short the bottom 10% and you hold it for a certain period and you repeat that process. Okay. So of course, so where does machine learning helps? All right. So it helps in it, it, how to say, it will not find that thesis. That's something else. That's the work of the researcher. It will help to mitigate certain errors that comes from the aggregation in the top percentiles.
Okay.
Or it will validate your thesis. That it can do. Machine learning can validate your
In
thesis.
what type to validate my thesis? Like what do you refer to? Can you please provide me with a short
What I
reference
mean
of your intention?
is that the machine learning basically any machine regression or classification algorithm basically tells you what your data allows to. That's it. All right. You
Okay.
think of your data as an orange, right? Or a lemon. So you're trying to squeeze the lemon, right?
Hmm.
So you can squeeze it with your hand, you'll get this amount of juice. You can
Correct.
squeeze it with a machine, you get even more juice. That's where machine learning comes in. But it will not find you the orange. So you understand? It will
Like
not.
your example.
It's a very
Squeeze
simple
the
example.
hell out of the lemon. That would be the title of the episode. Squeeze the hell out of the lemon using machine learning. I like that.
Yeah, so this is what it does. So once you want to understand that, now comes the question of the features and the engineering and so on. And this is a very difficult problem. Um, so what do I think? I mean, I always tr because I was trained as an econometrician, so I strive for the most parsimonious minimum kind of minimum number of feature as possible. That's my kind of my bias goes into. I don't like to take millions of, I do that, but I don't like it. I mean, take a whole bunch of features and just drag them into, put them in a certain machine, do a certain feature selection process, either with by mutual information, either by correlation analysis, either by any kind of test, right, relating them to the target in the training phase and so on. Or just throw them all together. Uh,
Hmm.
I prefer a certain economic relationship to begin with, and then try to use that and stay there within that framework if I can. If I cannot, then I have to go further and use the heavy machinery. So let's say, for example, I want to predict volatility, right? Sometimes you don't need millions of feature to predict volatility. You don't.
Correct.
You don't. I mean, you have a free four feature model and that's it. Simple linear regression and you get the best model for volatility, the
How do you think
heterogeneous.
about like I would stop you for a quick question. How do you think about like extracting the right features when you're actually doing your feature engineering process? Like I guess that nowadays most of the code for those machine learning models are actually generated by the models stand out there. But to be frank with you, how do you actually plan um, the feature engineering process? How do you actually extract the rightest features for your actual intention?
Um, that's a good question because, as I said, I really never, every problem is different, right?
Yeah,
Uh,
of course. Just
the
let's just take the example of the volatility of machine learning.
So I'm gonna give you the example of volatility is that
Hmm.
you understand really it's about the story. You need to create the story and the feature has to fit your story. The heterogeneous autoregression model, which is a volatility forecasting model by Corsi, is excellent because it brings a whole story and frames it properly. What the story is that you have several free actors. You have free principal actors in the market, those who trade for long-term holders, right? Those who hold for the mid range and those who are more short range speculators, right? So that's the
Yeah.
story. And he cap and the now so you have free significant actors in the market, right? The long, the mid, and the short traders. Now, now the question the feature needs to answer is how the feature captures the long-term traders, the short-term traders, and the midterm traders. How does it does that? That's where the features comes in. How do features account for that? So, and there you need to make what the model does. It, for example, it uses as feature the moving average of realized volatility for 5, 10, for 1 day, for 5 days, for 10 days, I think, and for 21 days. for example. Okay.
Okay.
There are certain variants of that. And what it does, what it now, so each feature captures an actor of the market. That's the story. That's the story. And this model performs very well, very, very well.
Mhm.
Um, and it's very simple to use. You can use it. You can use a simple OLS if you want. I mean, you don't need to do a whole thing. Um, so the moral of this story is that the feature has to go with your story and captures whatever it wants to capture. So for example, I'll give you a different framework, okay? A very even more simpler. Let's say I'm ranking funds, right?
Okay.
So, funds have they have their exposures. So here the feature has to be their respective exposures.
Correct.
Very simple. So this is the story. This is like the kind of the economics or the story behind it. Then there is a higher level than that, right? Is that, well, sometimes, most of the time, unfortunately, you don't know if the feature corresponds exactly to your theory, right? You're all right, because we're in the world of cause and effect, right? And we're trying to find the cause. So there are issues where you're trying to look for example, causality is very important. Causality, not correlation. Correlation is fake. It's not fake, but
Okay.
it doesn't. Causality is a very strong. So if you have higher
So you would have
causality,
to measure correlation with casualty and to actually look at the how do both of those parameters when they fit to each other or when they align or when they misalign to each other. That's what you refer to?
what I refer to is a certain. It's a different thing. Is what
Mm-hmm.
I mean is. Look, unfortunately, not always I have the time to do it. But if I have, like, if not always I have the time, but I try to make it. Like, for example, there is an idea of, for example, in the feature selection or understanding if a feature corresponds well to the target is to understand how this feature works vis-a-vis the density forecast. Okay, so
Okay.
let's take the simplest example. My target is to predict the return one day ahead, right? It has this return one day ahead comes from a density forecast. So then I have to see, I run a model where I have a density forecast with a feature A and another model without it. And I try to compare the density, how it improved my density forecast, for
Mm-hmm.
example. Um, and in this case, when I do this kind of test, I can really know that's a Misano and Giacomini test. When I perform that test, I can really evaluate the features, impact on the data generating process, right? All the return comes from a data generating process that are governed by a probabilistic law, how they impact either on the tails of the distribution. Sometimes you can find that a feature is insignificant most of the time, but when it comes to tail event, it is highly significant. There are features like that, right? And sometimes it can only be improve in the center of the distribution, like the normal cases. So that's a very good predictor for normal times. So you can in this kind of approach, you learn what the feature has. What is its information content. So that's
Okay.
now it's a very tedious test. So sometimes I have to compromise. So I like to use a lot the concept of mutual information, transfer entropy, especially transfer entropy, because transfer entropy really deals with the with the issue of causality, and it emphasizes causality over correlation, because correlation may be circumstantial, right?
Okay.
And causality is something else. Causality is really captures the notion of cause and effect. Econometric students learn, for example, that when they learned the Granger causality, is that it's that causality and correlation are not the same thing, right? Because in causality, you understand where the information flows, meaning that X may cause Y, but Y does not cause X. In correlation, it goes both way. The question, where is the information flowing from one to another, does not come up. In
Yeah.
causality, it does. And this is very
Mhm.
important. So if you're trying to look for in your feature engineering, really the question you really want to answer is that, is it causal? If it's not
Okay.
causal, then you have a problem. Not
So
correlated, causal. This is the key term.
that's like your point of view out of you doing feature engineering for your machine learning model in the financial industry. Like how
That's what I try. I mean, I try to do it when I can. I mean, it's there is always a constraint. But it,
how hard it is to measure casualty like in terms of like
causality,
yeah how hard it is because I do think it's a very tedious approach.
it
Might
is.
be or might not.
It can
Because
be
you
very.
said it, because you said that you have to compromise about like several issues when you're actually doing your feature engineering, and that's really intriguing because if you're compromising and you're looking for casualty, of
Okay,
like
causality.
a causality, and if you're looking for causality, like that has that has like a very intriguing point of view because if I think about it like not looking about correlation but looking about causality and those two have different circumstances and you would have to compromise because you're looking at causality. How do you actually know? How do you actually map the view out of all the tests that you're actually getting?
That's a good question. It's a good question. Um, okay, we need to agree first of all that we are, resources are scarce. We have to
Hmm.
agree on that. And the number one resource that is the most scarce of all resource is time. So if you're, for example, if you're designing a machine learning that operates in the intraday, right, the 5 minute, the 1 minute, and needs to learn something, it needs to learn fast and quick, right? So you cannot go and start running simulations and bootstrap and probability density as you go. It doesn't make sense. It will not work. You have to think about when you create a machine learning, it's very nice to make it the most you know, rigorous as you can. But if it's rigorous and it cannot be deployed, then you haven't done anything.
Then you
So
can the model cannot be deployed if it's rigorous.
no, 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 no. Let me rephrase it. The
Okay.
number one thing that you have to remember is that you want to create a model that can be deployed, right? So you don't. So sometimes you cannot create a model that going runs very let's say, tedious or long calculations, right? It's just unrealistic, or you don't have either the computer power or the time to do it. So you have to kind of like, okay, find the fastest way. For example, this is why I really like the metrics like transfer entropy. I really love that. Why do I like transfer entropy? Because it kind of gives me a very fast way to estimate and get an estimate of the causality process without spending too much time.
Can you
Uh,
please explain more about like the transfer entropy?
Basically,
Because I
transfer.
think that we would need to have like a certain connection between all the topics that we're speaking here.
Well, basically, we all know, all random variables come from a probability distribution, right?
Correct.
So, and we understand that there is the marginal distribution and there is the conditional distribution. In time series, especially in time series, we work with conditional distribution. So, what is the distribution of y given that at time? What is the distribution of y at t plus one given y at time t and x at time t. Okay? So the question is, So transfer entropy, what it measure basically, okay, the distance, the probabilistic
The-
distance between, okay, between let's say, for example, the conditional distribution of yt plus one conditional on yt, and
Mhm.
the conditional distribution of yt plus 1 conditional on yt and xt. Now, if the distance if the distance is large, right? If there
Mhm.
is if the distance is small, right? If it's very small or insignificant, it means that xt is not causal to yt
Yeah.
plus 1.
Okay. Okay. Now it makes sense.
All right. So this is the idea. Now this is now another the normal, right? The normal kind of version of it is Granger causality, which is you take, for example, yt plus one and you regress it on yt and on xt plus one, and you compare between the two models. That's Granger causality. It's pretty basic.
Mhm.
Uh, so when you do that, you kind of assume a linearity. With transfer entropy, you're more free, it's more empirical. So
Mhm.
that's one way. But
Okay.
I can go on and further and say, okay, but I can go and do the hard work, which is, for example, see how every feature impacts the distribution. And of course, there are other methods, for example, which sometimes, of course, there is, for example, the stepwise regression, right? That tries to basically, it's an algorithm that tries to evaluate the importance of a feature. I'm not so familiar with it, but it's a very tedious one. It's very
Okay.
rigorous, but very tedious. And of course, also there is the lasso or ridge regressions that have a regularization, and using the regularization you can really understand which feature are more important and less important. So these are very classical way to do it, and they're valid too. So it's a question. So there is you need to kind of understand how much do you need it and how much you don't need it. This is really the question. So depends.
Mhm.
Depends.
Okay.
As a general rule of thumb, it's I strive to the most simplest model I can. The simplest is simple is always better. So that's
Why?
of course because of course to start it's easier to deploy. This is very
Mhm.
important, and it's easier to interpret. And when you have something that is simple, you're less prone to errors. So
Oh,
as very
significant point.
simple. I
That's a
mean,
significant point
yeah. So, you're prone to, and it's also easier to communicate.
with the model,
Yeah,
with the output of the model. I mean,
right. Right. So,
mhm.
you want to communicate to your first and foremost to yourself, to communicate the model. So that's why I try to work with as simple as much. And sometimes you'll be surprised how simple things work so well, and
I can converse to complex neural networks.
in certain situation, yes, in certain circumstances. For example, let's take, for example, a random forest or, XGBoost and all these gradient boosting algorithm. They need a lot of data,
Mhm.
but we don't have a lot of data. I mean, we don't. We don't really have a lot of data in finance. This is very important. This is really key, is that we don't have a lot of data and we don't have a lot of history. You cannot compare. I mean, the S&P, we have a history of the S&P from I think the end of the 19th century, right?
Right.
Or the S&P or a certain theoretical. So, but we don't, it's not a lot of data. It's not. And it's an open system. So that's why also the issue of simplicity is very, very important. So sometimes you use XGBoost Learner does not. I can say that many times a simple linear regression or a simple logistic regression perform even better than random forest. And why is that? It's because of the data. there's not a lot of data, really. There's not a lot of data. Even intraday data, there's not a lot. It's kind of an illusion.
Hmm.
And, especially that, when you perform machine learning model, you don't always want to fit every data point or learn every data point. You want to learn significant points, points of reference. And when you take the significant point of reference, you lose a lot of data. So
Correct. By the
that's
way,
why
do you
also,
enrich some data points? Like if you're looking about enrichment, and if you're talking about like not fitting to the data and the lack of data issues and problems, do you try to enrich some data points in order to have like further more understanding uh, of 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 the model, or like different hypothetical situations like in the data to actually understand the causality of the things? Because I heard like um few typical papers who actually unveil the methodology of like enriching some data points in order to understand some different variants of the data. What do you think
I,
about that approach?
for example, using generative adversarial network, for example, that generate fake data. Do you mean
Could
like
be
that? Or
adversarial
bootstrap
networks.
method?
Could
Um,
be.
I think first of all, they're very important and really important, and it's something that I personally don't use enough. I have to admit, but the idea is very important, and I was especially not so much in deploying actually machine learning, but when you backtesting a strategy, this comes very, very, very important, right?
Obviously, obviously.
This comes to be very important. Or when you want to, get confidence interval of your estimate, right?
Mhm.
That's a very, I mean, that's very important. I haven't personally, I don't do it enough. I'm kind of bashing myself right now. Um, and but I think it's very important that is very important. I think that's, for example, this is an example where artificial intelligence is very, very important and is very helpful, right? It's not, we said it's a mean, it's not an end, right? So
Correct.
so for example, machine learning or AI comes in, sorry, artificial intelligence with, for example, generative adversarial network comes in very, very handy in circumventing the lack of data problem by generating similar kind of data that is similar but different, but it's similar. It's similar. It has the same, it supposedly has the same data generating process. And it's not even, and it's not new to artificial intelligence. Before artificial intelligence was very common, we used to do different things. We used to fit a gauge model and then generate random variables using this gauge models, or we used to even do something even more simple than just take the return series and shuffle the return,
Hmm.
just
Like in
shuffle
terms of
and
shuffling, like in terms of like trying to drop
right,
out like different
like
different parameters.
you take you have, let's say you have a series of return, right? I've done that once. Like, for example, I didn't know I wanted confidence interval without making any assumption about the distribution, the probability distribution. So what I did is that, I followed an example of a paper. I forgot the name of the author, but it was really brilliant. It's take the
What's the name of the
returns.
paper?
I have to look for it. I don't remember. It's been like
You would
I've done
have to. You'd have
it
to
was like 10 years
send it to me
ago.
afterwards. Send it to me afterwards, please.
I will look for it because I don't remember
Thanks.
the name of the author. There were Spanish researcher from the University of Barcelona, I think, something like that.
That's
Uh,
surprising.
but they have excellent schools in Spain and Greece. Greece has excellent also economics and econometric schools, by the way. Um, but what they did is they did something very simple. They took the return series, they shuffled it, and regenerated a new price without making any assumption whatsoever. And they did that 1,000, 10,000 of time, and they were able to get their confidence interval. So this is an example. So it's not new. Machine learning, I think, artificial intelligence, I think, even improves that even further, uh,
Okay.
and improves that very further. And this is exactly an example of what I was saying. Machine learning, AI, is not the end, it's a mean to something. It helps us, but it's not going to solve our problems.
Okay. Now for the continuous flow of model construction and model interpretation, I think the next major step is the backtesting methodology. Now, there's multiple backtesting methodologies, also methodologies which are widely used nowadays. That was heavily mentioned in the book of Marco Lopez de Prado that we have mentioned earlier. I would like you to tell me what do you think about backtesting? How do you backtest your machine learning model? Obviously, we have no data. How do you interpret the machine learning model to understand if the model fits or not fit the data? How do you think about it in general, and how do you dive deep into the core to understand how to backtest it properly and choose the right backtesting methodology?
Wow, this is the most difficult question, really, that I face myself every day because, okay, with backtesting is always very tricky. It's a very tricky process, and it's a process where you can really never know if you're right or wrong, really.
Correct.
So, I'm going to say, obviously, state the obvious. I'm a huge fan of walk forward analysis. Uh,
Oh,
well, it's
that's surprising. That's surprising.
why? Why is it?
I think that it's surprising because of we have just spoken about like shuffling different parameters and like
The
trying
different
to
problems. It's a
yeah
different problem.
it's a different problem but I like what do you think about the project methodology that was offered by Malcolm Lopez Prado? Like work
Which,
for analysis works very good, but like continuously building upon the same parameters does it sounds really really resonating with your perspective or point
well,
of view.
I wanted the backtesting procedure has to be, kind of a simulation of the reality as much as close as
Okay.
possible. Now, because we're dealing with time series, and and in the walk forward analysis, what's really good about walk forward analysis is that you get an understanding of how your model works within a certain regime. All right,
Hmm.
which is something that you cannot do otherwise, right? When you do, you cannot, it's a little bit difficult to do it otherwise. So when you perform a walk forward analysis, first of all, you get the notion, understanding that, and this is very important, how your model operates in reality. And you can make an analysis of the model weakness, especially understanding under which regime the strategy works and which strategy doesn't work.
So that's the interpreted
So that's the
aspect of
interpretive
view.
advantage. It's also where, which is also very important to acknowledge, is that you cannot, for example, when we're dealing with different issues, right, from emails, real estate problems, right? I once had like the issue of house pricing houses, which was not a series problem. It was a cross-sectional problem. So I can go back and forth and shuffle. I can do whatever I want. In time series, you cannot. You have to respect the flow of time, the historical of time. Um, and so what you can do, so the walk forward analysis, I think for now is maybe it's not the best, or maybe it can be improved, but I think that's what we've got because remember, regime changes, market changes, the nature of things changes all the time. History is completely always evolving, so we need to understand that. Now, it does not contradict the fact that if I do a walk forward analysis where I shuffle my data, I create new, let's call it fake
Yeah.
data or mirror or alternate universe data, I still want to keep the structure. right, of how time flows.
It
it
does
does
not
not
align.
contradict that.
Hmm.
So for backtesting, so that's one. Um, and also the backtesting is really understanding is trying to understand where your model is incomplete, where your model fails,
And
where
how do you
your model
identify where your model is incomplete? Like how do you understand from the data, from the output?
it can be many ways. For example, from the for example, you can be, for example, by, just straightforward looking at your periodic Sharpe ratios, for example. Or
Okay.
if you want to be a little bit more sophisticated, your periodic probability of ruin, right? If you if you also use it as a target, so you do that. You can also, just looking at basic performance of your simulation and understand what happened at that time. Um, it's kind of brings you up into it's a much more fundamental. What's really also very good is that the walk forward analysis really forces you to understand, okay, what are the fundamental forces that are working that are not included in the model. This is the kind of the review. Now, sometimes you cannot. We're constrained by data, by time, we're constrained. Our resources are scarce. But when you know that, you're you kind of try you know exactly the limits of your model. But this is not
Hmm.
even the most important part in the backtest,
Okay.
because the
Correct.
important thing of the backtest is the target. Now,
Hmm.
a lot of people, or a lot of examples that I see through the internet, uh, they look at they perform a backtest, and they perform a back test, and they really try to optimize their Sharpe ratios or performance ratios, and that's a problem. Because and this brings me back to the beginning of our conversation, is that there are probabilities. We live in an uncertainty, not on risk. And in
Yeah.
backtesting, when you're optimizing given a Sharpe ratio or something like that, what you're doing is that you're assuming your probabilities are known. You're not taking into account what you don't know. And that's
So
where
how
it's
do you avoid that?
so this is a very tricky philosophical question. For example, you you have to add the probability of ruin, and
Okay.
to parameterize it specifically in the backtest, is
Hmm.
what is the likelihood of ruin. And this is a different story, and it's a little bit more complicated. And this is another example, by the way, where fake data, let's call it the alternate data, right? The alternate universe data is really important because it helps you to really specifically put that inside this
Okay.
part, right?
Hmm.
So to, so it's a way for you to tackle uncertainty. That's another example why they don't contradict. There's no contradiction. Um, But overall, backtesting is, even when I run a machine learning model, I backtest, right? I do a walk forward, I train it X number of day, I test it for the N days ahead, and I do repeat, and I repeatedly do so. And I repeatedly do so. Also, because the fact that, either by expanding window or by a rolling window. I mean, this is a real question. Depends what I try to get or to model, um, and so on.
Hmm. Sounds very interesting, to be frank with you. Let's get back to our initial conversation about backtesting, and I would like to hear out of your experience, what's or what are the main things that you do, like when you're planning a backtest? Like you have spoken about probability of ruin, and have spoken about like making sure that the periods of the work forward will be like
Well split.
yeah, they will split, but they will have like a contradiction like to the probability that you have mentioned before. And how you actually how do you actually plan the backtesting? Because you're not like literally running the code and surprisingly you have backtest results. You're actually planning it. So how do you actually how do you actually think about that idea initially?
I'm going to say what's the ideal. The ideal is that I don't backtest my thesis. Someone else does it. That's the ideal, right? Because, I can be very biased as a person.
Mhm.
We're all human beings and we believe in something and we try to make it work. And sometimes we overzealously try to make it work. So,
Mhm.
preferably, if I have an idea, I prefer someone else to backtest it. I mean, I backtest myself to check and to have, okay, the idea is fine, but then there's need to be a certain round. Um, so vis-a-vis the backtesting, again, strive for simplicity as much as possible. Um, that's always key. Um, Try it to make it the most realistic as possible because especially as sequential as possible. For example, if you for people working in Python, the temptation to work in, for example, in a vector, like in a vector way, right? To vectorize to vectorize uh, it might really end up with, might really cause a lot of harm and mistakes, which you don't get when you sequentialize. So sequencing will take longer time, but will give you a better result and more reliable result for that end. Um, it's a question, it's a real question I always ask myself. Also, the parameters of the backtest, how many days to train, how many days to test. These are real issues that I tackle all the time, and I ask myself all the time. But I really, really sincerely believe that backtest has always to be with at least two people involved
Mhm.
because another thing is really behavioral. For example, let's say, for example, I'm developing a model. So my rule of thumb is, let's say, for example, we're 2026, right? So I will do whatever. I'll use data from until 2024, end of 2024, and then I will leave data from 2025 for someone else to check the model, right?
Okay.
To
Uh-huh.
avoid overfeeding, right?
Yeah.
Basically to neutralize my biases, my personal biases. I mean, that's
So
a
like in
mistake.
terms of the
I
data,
mean, it's
also
not
neutralize your position.
right. Look, it's not
Okay.
it's not like it's not that I am a genius. I made that mistake, so I don't want to repeat it again, right? So, for example, at some point I was training a model and it was doing excellent result, but I was basically training it by means of backtesting, right? Until the present. So really what I've done is overfit through time. Um, and this is the wrong approach to do it. So that's why also I always recommend backtesting. Create your model, stop at a certain point, leave some data for someone else to test it independently of you, and you'll get an honest assessment. It's very important. It's something
Mhm.
that unfortunately you learn through pain. This is learning through pain as
I
an
got it.
example. Yes.
I got it. Okay. Owen, after a pretty tough conversation, I would like to ease a little bit. And I would like to ask you some business-wise questions in terms of you running and doing like research for a fund that you
We're not a
for
fund, we're a company.
yeah, you're okay. So you're a company.
Very important, right? We're a technological company, not a fund. So this is a very important.
What's the definition between like what's the definition of both of them and like what's the differentiation of both of
Uh,
them?
I don't want to get into the whole thing, but it's just very important to stress that we're not a quantitative fund. I don't know. I mean, this is something that it's more legal. The but
I
it's
just
a distinction
realized.
that is important to make. This is a distinction that is important to make, right?
Okay, I got it. So, out of your perspective, like in terms of business view, how do you plan, like after deploying the model? Okay, now hypothetically speaking, your model is significantly good at doing what it does, and it outperforms your expectations. I'm not just speaking about market outperformance, but your own expectations, not just by one individual, but by multiple individuals who work together. Now, how do you actually approach approach a business opportunity after knowing that you have something valid in your hand, like in terms of scaling and in terms of actually the entrepreneurial aspect? Like, what do you think? How do
That's
you how do
that's
you
a
look
little.
at it in terms of the industry?
All right. I'm not, this is a question that is tough for me to answer because I'm much more heavily research inclined, right? So from my own personal experience, I did more research and I less touched the part of the deployment. So I don't really want to say something that might sound wrong, that might sound erroneous or wrong in any way. Having said that, um, if I've reached certain successful ideas in the time, the most important thing is to find someone who can attack them and criticize them because not to succumb to your own personal hybris. And as researchers have their hybris at the end of the day. We're researchers, we have our ego, it's your ego on the line. But the problem is that when your model doesn't get criticized, you might lose money, a lot of money. First, and not your money, someone else's money. So it's a
That's
big
fair point.
responsibility. So if I come into terms of a model that works in my lab, the first thing and it goes with what I said of keeping certain data unseen by the researcher itself and let someone else test it. This is where this is come part is to tame that part to tame our own personal ego. Um, so this is really what I try. Now, in terms of the deployment, it's something I touch less. I do think about the deployment when I run a model, always, always. But it's something that I personally have less experience in, and therefore I cannot really answer that question.
So it's like another role in the company who is responsible only for the deployment.
Every company is a different story. I mean, if
Yeah,
you,
they
I,
operate
I
differently.
assume that if we go into AQR, for example, so the researchers are the researchers, and the deployment is the deployment. It's two people, it's two different people, or two different units, really. But in some companies, it's the same person. But ideally, ideally, it has to be separated. And second is that from my own personal experience, I know how to perform the research, I know how to execute research, but deployment is a different story that I haven't touched really in my experience. I just, I haven't touched that yet.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Sorry to
So
disappoint on the last one.
again,
I'm sorry if I disappointed you in the last question.
you actually got me fascinated about learning how to deploy models correctly.
One
And
thing I one thing I
okay.
would say, there's also always that I've noticed that the real problem is many times the research language and the deployment language are not the same, even in terms of programming, right? So a lot of the
So how do
deployment,
you coordinate both of them?
That's a very complicated task and question. So, for example,
I
the
hope you
reason.
guys are friends.
Oh my God, this is a huge question. How you bridge the gap? Because this is
Correct.
and I have been exposed in and I've been in this situation. At some point, I backtested stock indices, right?
Hmm.
And in stock indices, it's very for the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange. It's really important that you be precise to to the five digit. I mean, it's absolutely horrendous that I used Python, right? And I got something like a value of 1,800.005, right? And the other person used Excel and got
Okay.
0.4. I mean, almost identical, but to the last digit, and that last digit is because probably Python has a different rounding scheme than uh, than Microsoft Excel. I mean, this is a very minor, and and because of regulation, you have to be exact and precise. So this is a
Like
problem.
like what type of, like FINRA regulation or like
Yeah, it's like
the
a
local Tel
simple
Aviv?
rule of thumb, like usual Tel Aviv Stock Exchange. I worked there for a short period of time. Really, the great place to work, by the way. Lovely people. But what one thing I always encountered is we back tested certain stock indices, any kind of candidate stock indices, is that we had always the issue of rounding numbers, really small, minor. I mean, in my world, it's pointless to fight if it's 0.001 versus 0.00999, right? It's for me, it's the same
Correct.
thing, right? But for them, it means a lot because of regulation, because it's a regulated company. But
Mhm.
this is just a simple example that gives you the problem of when you research in one language and you operate in a different language.
So how
Uh,
do you coordinate them?
huh?
How do
But
you actually coordinate them?
that's beyond my realm, but usually the CTO knows that's the job of the CTO to bridge that.
Mhm.
Sometimes a lot, for example, you can make a wrapper around Python and deploy it in C.
Mhm.
I mean, there are ways to circumvent the issues, but that's more of a question for the engineers, for the software
Okay.
engineers.
Mhm.
But it is a problem. It is.
Okay. So just a quick one before we go. Um, out of just asking, what do you anticipate out of yourself for the next years, like in terms of growth for your quantitative journey? What do you expect to learn? What do you expect to search?
Oh my God. It's look, we are in a I mean, we're in a unique time in history, right? We have those LLM language that help us a lot in one way and can trap us in another way, right? Um, so one thing really good is that before using the LLM, I was more focused on programming, on writing a code and writing the proper code. Now I have this little junior, so to speak, and I can think about more the idea. So the real issue is to find new ideas, or improving existing one, really. And that's a good that's a the real issue is that there is a challenge. Another challenge is that the market are changing all the time. Whatever was true today will not be true tomorrow, and it's
Correct.
important sometimes to uh you know take your head off the computer and read and be curious. So that's really to find out what's next, what's coming next, where the humanity is going in the future. At the end, that's what we do. We try to realize, we're trying to say where we're going. That's where we're always asking ourselves. I'm sorry, I'm not having any precise, definite answer to that, but that's really what underlies it. And I think for the future, with the advent of LLMs, your ability to criticize the world, to have a critical point of view will be much more important than your skills or even your computing skill, even your knowledge of machine learning, because the ML is closing, the LLMs are closing the gap very, very fast. Um,
Correct.
just a year
They
ago,
explain everything.
just a year ago, I would have put a problem to the LLM and it will get it completely wrong. And now it gets 90% right sometimes. And when generating code, for example, you can, it's a huge shortcut, though you have to be very careful and know what you're reading and you have to be careful. But in the future, we'll have to be even more philosophical than today. That's
Mhm.
how I see it. I mean, I'm going to say something that is not related to quantitative finance even, is that, it's, if I have three children, my eldest daughter is 16 and a half. She's in 11th grade. Next year she'll finish high school. And I'm trying to suggest her that she must learn philosophy.
Really?
Even before mathematics, economics, computer science, before everything. Why is that? Because
Just to think outside of the box, just to give yourself a level of questionnaire to tackle yourself, like to tackle your brain or to tackle your thoughts.
critical thinking is going to be is critical thinking will be the number one skill
Hmm.
is the skill of the future, is critical thinking, because the LLMs are closing the gap. The LLMs really they can close the gap, and they do so, and uh, and because they're closing the gap, and because we're going to be perhaps even more depending on them, that's where critical thinking comes into realization. I'm
Just
not
to
telling her, I'm not suggesting she'll become a philosopher. That's her choice. But as I really said to her, honestly, I took her to a philosophy lecture about Albert Camus at some point one evening, and I was explaining to her that, if you want to make it in this world, you have to be critical all the time, because we're in a world where everything is now generated. So if
Mhm.
you cannot criticize what is generated, if you don't have the tools to criticize what is generated, you're basically a user,
You're so right. You're so right.
but you're not a leader. And
You're
that
correct.
this is the number one skill of this is the skill of the future, is critical thinking. And the truth is, it always was. It always was.
I have nothing more to say. I have left, you have left me with no words, to be frank with you.
All right.
So, I want to close the conversation for today. I had a complete pleasure having you on our show, The
I
Blush Points.
The pleasure was
Um,
mine too.
and it was a significant conversation. I'm gonna be taking the notes when I'm gonna be hearing it off record, just because it was an amazing conversation. And by the way, the closure of the critical thinking and how to criticize think properly, it's like the entire thing that you're doing over your career, over your formal career as a researcher. So everything, like it's like a puzzle, everything gathers to each other. So thank you, and I
Thank
very
you.
appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.